Hello and welcome to the Reviews Brothers. This time round we're going to take a look at the titans of the silver screen, Godzilla and King Kong. They've had a few scraps along the way, but let's be honest, the only way to really see who's the best is to find out which one of the two giants has the best video games. Now, how about I shut the hell up and we take a look at some games. Let's start with what I think is the first King Kong game, back on the Atari 2600. What probably won't surprise you is that it's basically a clone of the Nintendo classic Donkey Kong. You play as, what I assume, is Jack from the movies, and you have to rescue Fay Ray from the top of the building after she's been captured by Kong, who apparently is a shit gingerbread man. Now, I know this is Atari, but is that really the best they could do? Anyway, Kong is at the top of the screen and you have to run, jump and climb your way up there. Rather than the barrels being thrown at you, some things come down at you instead that you have to jump over. Honestly, I have no idea what these are meant to be, but all that matters is that if you touch them, you're dead. In fact, Kong doesn't ever actually kill you himself at all. There's also gaps in the platforms. Fall down one of these and you're monkey meat. If you jump over the blue thing that looks like one of those drinks cups you get when you get a takeaway, it springs you up a level, which can be handy, but you've got to time it well so you don't hit one of the other whatever the hell they are that are above you. Once you get halfway up the screen, Kong moves from the top of the screen to the bottom of the screen, and with the whatever they are start moving in the other direction, coming up the screen towards you. And really, that's all there is to the game. There's only one stage and it just loops over and over, getting faster every time until it's basically impossible. There's a bit of sound and music here which is very similar to Donkey Kong, but it has that Atari charm. Basically, once you've managed to get to the top a couple of times, you'll likely be bored and have a mysterious craving for gingerbread. Godzilla's first home console game, that I have at least, was on the NES. Here you're presented with a grid where you can move either Godzilla or Mothra to different sections. You choose where you want them to go and then you have to fight your way through each grid in a side-scrolling action stage. These action stages feel pretty cheap and clunky, but I have to admit they kind of grew on me. Godzilla walks forwards and can smash stuff with his claws or his tail, and he even has his atomic breath. There's a lot of crap coming at you pretty much all the time, but thankfully you have a decent amount of health and you can collect more in the stages. The animation and stuff here is pretty minimal. In fact, if you crouch there's no animation at all and all you can do is slide across the screen. It's pretty funny. What is annoying is that a lot of the hits you take send you flying backwards, and because of your size it can be hard to avoid or even hit the enemies. Still, just keep walking forwards and you'll pretty much get through each level every time. If you play as Mothra, the game plays more like a shooter with you flying over everything. You have a projectile attack that repels enemies and their attacks, which is very handy. You can also drop a load of wings like bombs to hit anything beneath you. I'm not sure Mothra ever really did that in the movies, but never mind. There's also enemy monsters on the board and you'll have to fight them along the way. When you get to one of these, it's quite underwhelming to be honest. It's just you and the enemy on a blank screen. It's really a case of mashing the attack buttons and most of the time you'll win. The enemies have a few different attacks, but these can be easily dodged usually just by moving backwards, or if you're Mothra you just hover above them, but that doesn't always work, so watch out. Once you've beaten all the enemies on the board, you can move off it and on to the next one, rinse and repeat. This is one of those games that it's just fine. It's by no means a fantastic game, however if you're a Godzilla fan it does have a good amount of monsters in it, and being able to play as Godzilla or Mothra is a nice touch, even though neither of them control particularly well. I do also like the way the grid stages work, so you can decide who to fight and when, though it does seem a little redundant as it's not like you can power up or anything in the levels, so basically you just want to go straight to the bosses as quickly as possible. It would have been nice to have a reason to avoid them, just so you could get stronger and then go and fight them. Overall though, the game is okay. It's perfectly playable and you can have a bit of fun with it, but it's not without its flaws. Only really one for Godzilla fans. For some reason, most of Kong's games are on the Game Boy Advance. What I say for some reason is because they were based on a terrible animated series, and I think it was pretty cheap and easy to make games for the Game Boy Advance, so that's where they lived. Anyway, here we have Kong the Animated Series, an action platformer that is basically garbage. You of course play as Kong, who apparently here is the same size as regular people, so you're basically just a gorilla. And it's one of those games where you have to explore some pretty large levels to find a certain amount of items before you can go on to the next level, and as you may have guessed, it's just not fun. The game looks okay in stills, but when it's moving, everything just looks really cheap. The enemies, a lot of which are fucking humans, look strange, and the dinosaurs have really awkward movement patterns. It doesn't help that the combat is just terrible, the hit detection is poor, and you'll often get hit during your animations. It's really not good. You also control some of Kong's human buddies, who are just as rubbish as him. You have a double jump, and again some really poor combat with some of the most awkward attack animations I've ever seen. It's hard to tell if you're even going to hit things most of the time. Again, you are fighting dinosaurs, humans, and giant versions of regular animals. I really can't stress just how much fun this game isn't. There are leaps of faith all over the place which usually end up in a bottomless pit, tedious item hunting which is never fun, and if you've watched any of these videos on this channel before, you've noticed that it always seems to be a thing with licensed games, making you explore some levels that aren't fun to navigate, to find hidden items but being given no indication of where they are. This one stinks more than one of Kong's turds. Avoid it. But Godzilla also had a crappy TV series, based on the American Godzilla movie that we try not to talk about. The series got two games which are basically identical, so I'm going to lump them both together here. The first one was Godzilla the series, and of course it's a terrible auto-scrolling game, where you play as Godzilla. The screen is always moving forward, and each of your buttons does an attack. You can aim Godzilla's head very slowly, and fire little snotballs which move also really slowly. But there's no indication of where your shot is going to go, so chances are you'll miss most of them. You can also use your claws, tail, and have a stomp attack, all of which take forever to pull off, making it impossible to hit anything. You can also push back to block, but you have a block meter, so you can only do this for a short time, though to be fair, the block bar will probably last longer than your attention span in this game. It moves at a stupidly slow pace, and the levels seem to go on forever. As you get points, you unlock new moves, which are generally pointless or just plain don't work, to add to the frustration. Eventually, you'll get to a boss, and these are just a case of attacking a few times and then blocking their slow attacks, and repeat. Your health constantly regenerates, and so does your block, so as long as you block every now and then, you're unlikely to die. The game is also a definition of a cash grab. It looks awful, sounds awful, and plays even worse, so in a way, it's the perfect game to accompany the movie and series. 1 year later, they released a sequel, Godzilla Monster Wars, also for the Game Boy Color, and somehow it manages to be worse in every way. The game plays almost identically to the first one, but the graphics here are worse, and it moves even slower, and the controls still barely work here too. They've tried to add some things. Now you get a little reticule to show you where your snot breath will go. You also have control when you move forward. Great. But they've made it even worse here by making you need to collect power-ups to refill your health and to block. To do this you need to shoot them with your snot breath, but it's so hard to aim that it's almost impossible to do, so it makes the game stupidly hard. This is possibly the worst game I've played on the Game Boy Color. It really has no good aspects to it. Avoid. Kong's next Game Boy Advance game is Kong King of Atlantis, another one based on a crappy TV series. And guess what? It's another crappy game. You start out playing as some annoying guy who has to punch monsters made of tar. Of course, the developers made sure that the controls and animation are as poor as possible to give you that authentic survival feeling. The jumping here is especially bad, and if you like jumping in bottomless pits, well, you'll probably love it here. After a while, you take control of Kong, and absolutely nothing improves. You fight the exact same enemies with one boring punch, and in fact, you spend most of your time punching the crap out of trees rather than enemies to clear a path. The only saving grace for this game is that you don't have to collect any items to finish a level. Instead, they made sure to include random shit that flies out of nowhere that you have no way of avoiding, enemies that don't react properly when you hit them and just plow into you, and barely any health kits, to ensure that you can have as little enjoyment as possible while playing the game. Sorry Kong, but you've really been shafted here. Godzilla did also get himself a Game Boy Advance game, Godzilla Domination, and hang on a minute, this one's actually pretty fun. It's a fighting game where you choose from a modest selection of monsters before a big-boobed anime woman tells you that there's a fight going on somewhere. The game is basically like SNK's King of the Monsters games, but a more basic version. The game looks great with a fun cartoony style that personally I really like. The monsters all have some great animation, and there's always loads going on each of the levels, with cars and planes always zooming around. The actual fighting here is good, but very limited. You only have 2 attack buttons with no real combos or specials. You just pound, punch or kick over and over again. There are a couple of specials you can do by pressing a few combinations of buttons, and you've got to build up your meter to do them. They're decent enough. As you go through the story mode, you have one-on-one matches as well as team battles where you have some help, or sometimes a 2-on-1 versus against you match. Every now and then there's bonus levels too. To be honest, these are more annoying than anything, and they go on far too long. I could do without these, but you can't even turn them off. Godzilla Domination does have a kind of addictive quality to it. Despite the fact that it's pretty shallow, it is a decent time waster. Of all the handheld Godzilla games, this is definitely the best one. And finally for the King Kong handheld games is King Kong the official game of the movie. And shock horror, this is a great game. Instead of a crappy platform one, here we have essentially a Zelda game based on Skull Island, and it works really well. You usually have 2 or 3 characters with you at any time, each with their own abilities, so you'll need to switch between them on the fly to solve puzzles and access new areas. Then of course there's times where you play as Kong, which play more like a beat 'em up, where you'll be fighting off evil dinosaurs and the such. These are fun, but the combat is a little sloppy. It is still satisfying to punch dinosaurs in the face though. The real meat of the game here though are the exploration sections where you play as the humans. You'll find all sorts of items along your way that you can use to craft new items like ropes and bombs and rafts that help you explore. Of course, there's plenty of enemies all over the place, from giant animals, plants and dinosaurs to the native islanders, who you never actually kill, you just scare them off, which I thought was quite a nice touch. Along the way you'll find dungeons which have some really tricky puzzles in them. In fact, I'll be honest, I got stuck here a lot more than I care to admit, but they are all fun to work out. The game also looks great with a nice art style and plenty of good animation. If you're a fan of Zelda adventures, or King Kong, or just good games, then this is definitely one to pick up. And now, how about we have a look at some games with polygons? Here is Godzilla Destroy All Monsters Melee for the Nintendo Gamecube. It's a fighting game where you get to duke it out as some of your favourite Toho monsters. There's a story mode where an alien tells you that they've mind controlled all of the monsters, and they even try to put some comedy in there. So you choose your favourite one and you set out to stop their evil plans of world domination. What's nice here is that the game just doesn't take itself that seriously and just sets out to be as much fun as possible, and it definitely succeeds in that. All the monsters feel huge and have a decent amount of weight behind them. They don't have the biggest movesets, but they've got enough variety of punches, kicks, throws and projectiles to keep you going, and each of the monsters plays very differently, so it's fun to try them all and find out your favourite. Speaking of monsters, what is a bit of a shame is that there aren't too many. I mean, there are 11 to choose from, which I guess isn't bad, but 2 of them are just different versions of Godzilla, and you've got Ghidorah and Mechaghidorah, who are basically the same apart from a couple of moves. If you ask me, these could have been alternate skins, not separate characters. There's so many cool monsters that I would have loved to have seen here, like Ebera or King Caesar. Ah well. The fights all take place in cities across the world, and they have a different feel to them. Some of the cities have huge skyscrapers, where others are small port towns. It's great, and the whole game looks fantastic too. It's definitely a game that you'll need to play for an hour or so to get used to the feel of it, as attacks can feel slow and cumbersome, but that's kind of the point, and once you've played it for a bit and you're used to it, you'll have a blast. Picking up buildings and slamming them into your opponents is always fun. The game gets even better in multiplayer too. You can play with up to 4 players, and it's absolute chaos. In multiplayer you have a timer and you score points as you fight, and at the end of the match whoever has the most point wins. It gets really heated, and me and my friends used to spend hours playing this game. If you're after a great versus multiplayer game or love Godzilla, then you definitely need to own this one. And now for the one that everyone's probably been waiting for, the stupidly named Peter Jackson's King Kong the Game of the Movie. The game was released for PS2, Xbox, Gamecube, DS and Xbox 360. This is the Xbox 360 version, which is the best one. This game has to go down as one of the best movie tie-ins of all time. It's a fantastic action survival game. It loosely follows the plot of the film as you set off to Skull Island to find Kong, and of course it all goes wrong and you've got to rescue Anne from the natives and Kong himself. It's a first-person game with no HUD, which at the time was very original and gives the game a very cinematic feel. All the characters are voiced by their actual actors, so you'll spend a lot of the time having Jack Black shouting at you, which is always a good thing if you ask me. Graphically, the game still looks fantastic. The environments especially look great, with some excellent lighting and a lot of detail. It does have a few sharp edges and the character models are pretty dodgy, but this was a launch game for the system, so it can be forgiven. You'll be fighting all sorts of creatures, from giant crabs to massive V-Rexes, all of which are out for your blood. And the game has a neat feature, which is the food chain, so basically you can use it to your advantage. If you're sneaky, you can kill a smaller enemy and then use its corpse to entice a larger enemy over, and then you can just sneak past. But if you have to fight, and you will a lot, you get a handful of guns with very limited ammunition. Luckily, there's spears lying around all over the island, as well as in the skeletons of dead creatures, you've got unlimited ribs which you can throw like spears. King Kong also has a decent fire mechanic, which you can use to scare or kill enemies. Fire spreads quickly and you'll often have to use it to clear paths or get rid of monsters. And then, just when you're getting tired of being a puny human, the game switches so you can play as Kong, who's basically a furry Prince of Persia, doing all sorts of parkour around the island and smashing the shit out of dinosaurs. It's great! In these sections, it's pure action. You get a fixed camera for a lot of it, which can be obstructive, but it works pretty well for the most part. Unfortunately, none of the Kong sections last very long, but they're always a welcome break, and fighting the V-Rexes is a lot of fun. Something that can be pretty annoying though is when you get hit, you have a regenerating health, but the screen goes a very dark red and it's almost impossible to see what's going on, so you end up just getting killed anyway. The first time it happens, it does look kinda cool, but after a few times, it's just frustrating, and you can't see what you're being attacked by. The biggest complaint though with the game is that it's very linear. You basically follow one single path all the way through, but to be fair, most of the time you don't really notice, and you'll be having too much fun to really care. The game is super cheap these days and it's definitely worth picking up. It's also one of the easiest games to get all the achievements for, you literally just have to complete it. So, no excuses, go out and get this game now. We're going to take a look at Godzilla Unleashed for the Nintendo Wii. This time round, rather than a straight up fighting game, it's more of an adventure. We have more of a 3D world to run around, where you play as Godzilla, and you set out to rescue the world from other monsters that have been trapped, and of course you have to beat the crap of anyone that gets in your way. The story here involves crystals that do bad stuff. I won't lie, the cutscenes are all cheap stills and they just didn't keep my interest, but I doubt the whole thing was Shakespeare. Throughout the levels you can destroy crystals that help even out the factions. Yep, you have the Earth defenders like Godzilla, Anguirus and Rodan, you have the aliens like King Ghidorah or Gigan, and you have the EDF with the likes of Jet Jaguar. There's even mutants like Biollante and Megalon. As you play through the levels you can destroy buildings and crystals that give certain factions more power, so you want to make sure to take out any that aren't part of your faction. Yep, that's right, the game has loads of monsters for you to unlock, and as you play you earn points that can be exchanged for more monsters to use in the arcade and multiplayer modes. Each level gives you a couple of objectives to complete, all of which boil down to smashing stuff or kicking the crap out of the other monsters. For the most part they're pretty fun, if a bit repetitive. As it's a Wii game, there have been some crappy motion controls tacked on. Luckily, most of what you need to do can be done by just pressing buttons, so punching, kicking and using your atomic breath is just a button press away. But to jump you have to fling the nunchuck upwards, which to be fair works every time, but for a lot of your special attacks these are done with a combination of buttons and gestures which were very hard to pull off, and I found myself just not bothering most of the time. Thankfully the game is pretty fun to play, so this didn't make me give up. The graphics are decent with some great animation and it all plays at a decent pace. What's cool is that as you're playing a level more monsters will just show up for the fight, which can make things tense. And thankfully they fight amongst themselves too, so you can just leave them to have a fight while you run off and heal. Just make sure you get the last attack in. Godzilla Unleashed isn't a game that you'll be playing for hours at a time, and it does get repetitive, as most of the missions are pretty much the same. But it's always fun smashing up cities and unlocking new monsters. It's worth playing in short bursts. Here is Godzilla for the PlayStation 3, and I believe it also got an upgrade for the PS4, but I'm not paying those prices for it. Again, you play as Godzilla, which is really how all Godzilla games should be if you ask me. There is a flimsy story here where humans have managed to harness some of Godzilla's energy, known as G-energy, but the G-Man isn't too happy about it. It's stored in huge generators and is being used to power entire cities, so it's actually kinda handy. Still though, Godzilla wants to put a stop to that, and each level sees you going to the various places that have the G generators and smashing them to bits. While you're at it, you might as well smash as many buildings as you can and stomp on anyone stupid enough to get in your way. Because of the extreme potency of G energy, other monsters are also drawn to the generators, so as you fight and demolish stuff you might see a few familiar faces show up to have a scrap. Other than smashing buildings and generators though, there really isn't anything else you need to do here. The story mode has less than 10 levels, and there is an emphasis on replaying them as you do get branching paths. And there's a fair bit you can unlock here to be fair, mainly new monsters that can be used in the battle or diorama modes. Controlling Godzilla is pretty clunky, which I think is partly by design as he's a huge hulking monster, but also partly just crappy controls. You have to turn left and right using the shoulder buttons, which can take a bit to get used to. Every other button lets you do some sort of building smashing attack, or of course your radiation breath. The levels are pretty small here, and you can beat most of them in just a couple of minutes. There's things to find in them, which you do by smashing certain buildings, mainly landmarks, and there's certain spots on the levels where you'll want to get Godzilla to walk through so the humans can record him and get some new info, allowing them to better make weapons to fight off any giant monsters that turn up. These bits are actually pretty cool, as the camera angle changes to a different, more cinematic view, but really all it does is make it harder to figure out what the controls are. Now I do have to say that I actually quite like the graphics here. The monsters look great, sure the rest of it is pretty basic and there's a fair bit of slowdown when you're smashing stuff up, but it might be the Godzilla fanboy in me, though even though this is a pretty boring repetitive game, I did kinda like it. I would recommend this actually to any big Godzilla fan, especially if you can hack your PC and get it for free, which I may or may not have done. But for anyone else, I would say maybe don't bother with it. And yes, we've had 2 Godzilla games in a row, but that's so I could specifically finish on this one. That's right, it is Skull Island Rise of Kong, released just last year, not that you'd know it by looking at it. Skull Island Rise of Kong is already infamous for looking and playing like a game from the PS2 era, and while I usually like to debunk these over-dramatic internet people about these sort of statements, I do have to say they're kind of accurate with this one. It's a third-person action game where you play as Kong, who sees his family being murdered by a massive dino beast when he's just a young killer gorilla. In the first section of the game, that is. Then he manages to escape, and then we take control of him when he's much older and conveniently has the same moveset that his mother did in the opening section of the game. You've got to explore Skull Island, fighting enemies and learning new abilities that let you access new areas, like a smash attack that can break certain walls and rocks, new ways to swing over things to get across certain areas, and that sort of thing. Yeah, it's kind of like a Metroidvania. It is pretty open world and can be surprisingly hard to know where you need to get to and what you need to do. Thankfully, you have a raw move that you can do which highlights key areas that you want to visit, though I didn't really find this very useful, and I'd often get to the marked areas and still couldn't do anything. I spent a lot of my time wandering around aimlessly, which I guess is kind of a good thing as the game can be beaten in under 3 hours, so they've got to pad it out somehow. As you'd expect, there's loads of enemies all over the place in the form of giant creatures or dinosaurs. You'll need to fight these quite often, and usually you can't leave an area until you've punched enough of them in the face. There's a few attacks you can do, actually not really. You've got a normal combo and a stun move and that's about it. You can also grab some smaller enemies and chuck them. Basically you just need to hit the stun button, spam everyone with your normal combo and then hit the stun again and repeat. You can grab things like small trees and use them as weapons as well, which I kinda like. The actual combat isn't really all that bad and is sometimes even enjoyable. But you can die very quickly if you're not careful. If even just a few enemies gang up on you, it's easy to get stun locked, which is never fun and just cheap. As you get deeper into Skull Island, you'll see a variety of locations, from your usual jungle and cave systems to swamps and more caves. Sadly, the enemies don't really get mixed up at all, and it's still just crabs and mini dinosaurs, with the odd spider thrown in here and there. The game is pretty glitchy as well, but you knew that already. There's pop-in graphics, including enemies that appear out of nowhere, texture problems and geometry that goes mental. It didn't really have any issues with the controls, which I was kind of surprised with. They actually function just about fine. The graphics are pretty crappy, with some really ugly character models and animations on the Kongs. The scenery looks fine, but it's about as basic as it gets, so much of it just looks like it uses stock assets. The problem with the game is that it's just clearly been rushed out, and apparently it was made in just 1 year. Everything is pretty unpolished, and while it definitely could not look like this or play like this on a PS2 generation console, it really does feel like it was made for that era. And actually, if it was, it probably would have been quite well received back then. Although the game based on the movie is still light years better than this one. So yeah, if you're looking at this as a modern game and comparing it to AAA titles that also came out at the same time, then it does do a hell of a lot wrong. And I would probably agree to an extent that it deserves the panning that it gets for a game released in 2023. But if you go in and just pretend that it's a PS2 or Gamecube game that's been re-released, which is basically what I did, you might actually get a bit of fun out of it. Definitely don't pay more than a £5 for it. In fact, maybe don't pay for it at all. We shouldn't be encouraging this sort of behaviour in the gaming world, but I'm sure there's other ways you can find it. So there you go, a bunch of games based on King Kong and Godzilla. It's not all of their games, well actually I think it might be all of the Kong games, but it's not all the Godzilla ones. There's a few strategy ones out there which are mostly Japanese, and there's quite a good beat 'em up on the SNES. Probably should have included that one really. As always, let me know your thoughts on these games in the comments below. If you ask me, King Kong on the Xbox 360 is probably the best game here, but overall I think the quality is better and more consistent with the Godzilla games, especially with the good fighting game on the Gamecube. I really enjoy that one. Anyway, all that's left for me to say is thank you for joining us, and we'll see you next time.